Okay, I'll start now. Good afternoon. My name is Michael Otten, and I'm a co-founder of a nonpartisan group of business and law school alumni called Reform Elections Now. We came together 2 years ago at a Harvard Business School alumni luncheon meeting, which was organized to review a thesis by Catherine Gale and Harvard professor Michael Porter that the current politics industry is an anti-competitive duopoly with negative impacts affecting American business competitiveness. They identified that election processes are a major part of the problem, and therefore also a potential route for solutions. Our team
Michael, you become muted. Still muted.
Okay, am I back on again?
Yes, you are. And Peter, you better unmute yourself too.
Okay, let me just try to be sure. Did any of it come through, or do I have to restart?
Repeat your last sentence or two.
Well,
And
we were
John
working off a
Lazar
thesis
should
by
start.
Catherine Gale and Harvard professor Michael Porter that the current politics industry is an anti-competitive duopoly, which has negative impacts on American business competitiveness. They identified in their work, and by the way, they've published a book in June called The Politics Industry. They identified election processes as a major part of the problem, and therefore also a potential route for solutions. Our team believes that we can achieve progress through education and civic engagement, which are aimed at making government work. Our organization is nonpartisan, and it's made up of Republicans, Democrats, and independents, but we've never included the word donate in our communications. We appreciate the opportunity to share today some of the less intuitive findings from our work. We would welcome your subsequent involvement, as we believe there are needs for systemic change that require thoughtful action beyond 2020. The worst outcome of this year's election could be to forget the risks and do nothing to mitigate them for future generations. We've looked at pros and cons of various proposed reforms and published relevant white papers on our website. There are significant election process innovations to be aware of on this year's ballots in Maine, Massachusetts, Florida, and Alaska, dealing particularly with opening primaries, ranked choice voting, and gerrymandering, as well as other election-related innovations. We shall be taking some polls during today's presentation to share views from you and with you about how you perceive different scenarios affecting the financial markets and businesses. Herb Kaplan will be monitoring the chat window in order to moderate questions for discussion after the presentation by Peter Cyrus. Peter hates detailed introductions, but our election reform team acknowledges and very much appreciates the intellectual depth along with research and communication skills that he has brought to a truly complex subject. Although he's authored many case studies as well as popular fiction and nonfiction books, there will be no book signing this afternoon. I now turn it over to Peter.
Excuse me, can I ask first, John Lazar is sharing his screen and that's all we're seeing.
Herb, are you able to manage that?
I don't know what just happened. I see that John Lazar.
I think what happens is anyone can share their screen the way you have this set. So now you have to go back and share yours because it was knocked off.
Okay.
Okay, I just did that.
Perfect. Thank you for the good advice. Peter, back to you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
So today's subject is how to avoid a black swan in 2020. Now, a black swan is an unpredictable and often catastrophic event that falls outside the boundaries of normal prediction, but that in retrospect can be understood. In the past 23 years, there have been many financial black swans: the Asian financial crisis, dot-com crash of 2000, Fukushima, 9/11, the financial meltdown, the European sovereign debt crisis, Brexit, and the COVID market crash of this year. In many cases, there were analysts who predicted the crises, but few in the financial markets or business were willing to listen or assess risk. Now, most black swan events were caused by financial issues, none except Brexit really related to politics. There have been a few instances in which markets did react to elections. In 2000, the markets dropped during the disputed Bush v. Gore election. In 1901, the markets declined 10% after the assassination of McKinley. And in 1876, they declined 10% during the disputed Hayes-Tilden election. However, these really weren't black swans. Now, we do not believe that a black swan will occur in 2020, but we think in this time of political polarization and pandemics, events could unnerve financial markets. So in this presentation, we're going to consider every potential event that could occur to disrupt the presidential election. We're not contending that every event will occur. However, by presenting these alternatives, we want to open the discussion of how financial markets and businesses could react under each of the potential scenarios and see what events you as business professionals believe represent the highest risk.
Peter, it's Herb Kaplan. I want to interrupt. Someone sent a message saying they can't see the slides. I just want to be sure we can. Barbara, why don't you unmute and let me know if you can see the slides?
I can see them.
Okay, fine. Peter, continue.
Now, I just want to tell you that at the end of the presentation, I'm going to give you a secret of how to figure out the election. And this is something that should be very interesting. So stick with me through the presentation. So on election day, Donald Trump holds an 8-point lead in the popular vote and leads in states with 460 electoral votes. According to the exit poll, 81% of Trump voters voted in person versus 31% of Biden voters. And Trump declares his victory from the 18th hole at Mar-a-Lago. He wasn't on the fairway the whole time, but he still declared his victory. Now,
Peter, do you want to ask people how they would react to that in terms of the markets, or continue going on?
Okay. The blue wave starts. As the mail-in votes are counted, Trump's lead shrinks to 3%. Trump tweets, "Mail-in votes are frauds, must go with election night." These are actual quotes of Trump. These aren't quotes that I'm implying to him. These are things he's actually already said. By the 10th, as mail-in counting continues, Biden takes a 1-point lead. And Trump says, again, a real quote, "The result of the November 3rd vote will not be known for years. I'm not a good loser. I think mail-in voting is going to rig the election. I really do." So slow counting as the blue wave grows. By the 17th, states are continuing to count mail-in votes. Biden pulls ahead by 4 points in the popular vote. Trump continues to tweet about fraudulent mail-in votes. But in New York, as an example, less than 25% of the mail-in votes are counted, and rejection rates are over 20%, and lawsuits are brought by both parties in competitive races. The slow counting and rejection rates continue to plague states. Millions of ballots are left to count in many states. Some states that started early still have elections too close to call. And lawsuits are filed over the counting of mail-in ballots in 18 states, 11 Senate races, and 94 House of Representative elections. Now, by November 24th, the blue wave continues, but margins are close in swing states. Biden has a 7-point lead. He leads in states with 318 electoral votes, but Trump says mail ballots, they cheat. Mail ballots are very dangerous for this country because of cheaters. They are fraudulent. And as you can see, in many states, many of the swing states, the popular vote in the election is very close. Now, just so there's no confusion, you see at the bottom of this chart, Maine #2 and Nebraska #2. Maine and Nebraska are two states that allocate their electoral votes for the state as a whole and then each congressional district. So Maine actually was the only state in the last election to vote for both Trump and Clinton. Clinton won district #2. Now, it's on December 8th is a day called Safe Harbor Day. And it's the day on which states must attest that they have an official result. The only problem is counting is continuing and lawsuits are filed over the election in 18 states. And 5 states, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Michigan, Ohio, and Florida, have already begun official recounts. On the 14th, the state electoral college meets. With recounts and lawsuits, delegations in many states are not able to certify the results. And so on the 18th, the state legislatures meet. Now, states do not want to cede their electoral college votes. So in accordance with something called the Electoral Count Act of 1887, legislatures in each of the pending states meet and appoint electors. Although Biden has a lead in 6 of the 9 states, Republican legislatures in all the pending states cast their votes for slates supporting Trump. And in Maine, the Democrats give Biden their vote in Maine #2, and in Nebraska, Trump gets Nebraska #2. But Democratic governors in Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania appoint a separate slate of electors supporting Biden. So now you have in 4 key states, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania, 2 sets of delegates. The Trump delegate is appointed by the Republican legislatures, and the Biden delegates supported by the Democratic legislature. So maybe we'll take a second to see, based on all the things that have happened from November 3rd to December 18th, how do you think financial markets are going to react? And your choices are a steep rise over 6%, a slight rise, less than 3%, little change, slight decline, steep decline.
Okay, we'll take a few seconds to see the results coming in. I'm seeing how many results are coming in, and we'll let the poll run for another 10 seconds or so. So if you want to vote, do it quickly.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to end the poll, and I'm going to share the results with you. As you can see, 33% of those who responded, and I think we have almost 100 responses, 33% project a slight decline, and 49% a steep decline, which is defined as more than 6%.
Okay, so I'll continue. On December 21st, the Supreme Court refuses to rule on the legitimacy of the competing slates, claiming the election rules have been determined by the 12th and 20th Amendments. Now, if you don't know the 12th Amendment, it was ratified in 1804 after the deadlocked election in 1800. On the 35th ballot, Alexander Hamilton switched his vote to Thomas Jefferson, and that got Jefferson elected over Burr. and ultimately led to the duel between Aaron Burr and Hamilton that killed Hamilton. Now, the reason I bring this up is not so there'll be a constitutional quiz at the end, but just to let you know that we're hoping that none of the candidates are killed in duels over this election. And the reason we're hoping that is, believe it or not, the US Constitution does not have any clear rules for succession if a candidate dies between the election and when Congress has approved the vote of the Electoral College. Anyway, on the 23rd, the votes are sent to Mike Pence. A new Congress takes office on the 3rd of January. Now, Senate races in Georgia, Texas, Iowa, Alabama, a whole bunch of other states are still being contested. The Republicans have 41 seats compared to the Democrats' 45. But under something called the 17th Amendment, governors in these states can appoint candidates to temporarily fill the Senate seats. So governors in a whole bunch of states appoint Republicans, Republican governors appoint Republicans, Democratic governors of Michigan, Maine, and Kentucky appoint Democrats. Of course, that means Mitch has been ditched and is no longer the majority leader, but the Republicans still have a 51-47 majority, which the Democrats challenge, but it's not doing them any good right now. And the Democrats retain control of the House because, unlike the Senate, vacancies in the House can only be filled by special elections. Okay, so now on the 6th of January, Mike Pence begins the count of the electoral votes and announces he has 2 sets of votes from 4 states and that Congress has to adjudicate their validity. So the 2 houses separate. The Republicans in the Senate approve the Trump slates, giving Trump 294 votes. The Democrats in the House approve the Biden slates, giving Biden 305 votes. Of course, both parties immediately challenge the results in federal court, and the House of Representatives resolves to not invite the Senate back into its chambers for continuing the count until the issues related to the disputed states are resolved. So then later on the 6th, with a conflict between the House and the Senate, Mike Pence instructs the House to select a president according to the rules of the 12th Amendment. Now, this is, stick with me here, it's a little complicated, but what the 12th Amendment says is that in the House, each state shall have 1 vote. In other words, California has the same number of votes as North Dakota. Florida has the same number of votes as South Dakota. Given that, the Republicans actually have a majority of the states. The Republicans control 23 states, Democrats 22, and 5 states are either tied or because of legal challenges have no representation. The 23 states controlled by the Republicans vote to elect Donald Trump as president. But the 22 states controlled by the Democrats and the 5 even or contested states don't vote. And so as you can see from the 12th Amendment, the last line, you need a majority of the states voting, so there is no decision reached. So the House of Representatives does not appoint anybody as president. Okay, now we're going to ask one more time, how is Marcus reacting to the House not appointing a president?
Okay, remember, we're now on January 6th. Yeah, I see the responses coming in. I'll let you know when we're going to be turning it off. Ten more seconds. Okay, let me share the results. Now we're seeing that 78% of those who responded, nearly 100 people responded, 78 said they expect a steep decline, which we define as more than 6%. 16% expect a slight decline, and 7% expect little change. And Peter, I'm assuming this is this is above and beyond how the market has
Yeah.
performed in the last weeks.
Oh, so then, okay, sorry, I switched to the next slide. With neither candidate able to secure a majority of the Electoral College, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, third in line for the presidency, declares she will serve as president until the election is resolved. So now we have a president, Nancy Pelosi. Of course, the Senate meets, and with Republicans filling the disputed seats, the Senate, under the 12th Amendment, votes to elect Mike Pence as vice president, because the House can elect the president, the Senate can elect the vice president. Since no president has been selected by the Electoral College, Mike Pence declares that since he's second in line, he will serve as president until the election is finalized. So now we have two presidents. The Supreme Court, again, refuses to consider the results, claiming it's the responsibility of the legislative branch. Trump protests the actions of the House, calling the election the greatest fraud in U.S. history. Biden says he trusts the American system of government. The news media is 24/7 on the crisis. Protests and riots break out through the United States. Russia invades Latvia and Estonia. China blockades Taiwan, and Turkey invades Cyprus. So now on the 11th and 12th, in the Senate and the House, civility is almost non-existent. Representatives of both houses of Congress accuse the other of creating a constitutional crisis. Donald Trump announces he will serve another term. More riots break out, and stock markets around the world plunge. Now, on the 13th, with riots and protests erupting throughout the country, Russia invading the Baltics, China blockading Taiwan, Turkey invading Cyprus, Donald Trump invokes two laws, the National Emergencies Act and the Insurrection Act of 1807. These are real laws. We're not making these things up. To deploy both the military and the National Guard. And Trump announces that he will continue to serve as president until the national emergency is ended. So now we have three presidents. On the 15th, protests and riots expand throughout the United States. Democrats call Donald Trump a despot and a dictator. Trump calls the Democrats thugs and accuses Schumer and Pelosi of treason. Trump mobilizes the Army and the National Guard. Gun-wielding militias from both sides clog the streets, and people remain barricaded inside their homes. Okay, next quiz. How do the markets react to this?
Give another 10 seconds.
Interesting that there's a couple of people who actually think there might be a slight rise in the market. I'd love to have them explain.
Okay, let's share the results. 95% expect a steep decline. And as you can see, there are a few people who are saying a slight decline, and a few actually see a slight rise. That'll be interesting. So, Peter, continue.
Okay. Now, as the vote continues, Joe Biden claims that he's won the presidency because claims he's won the votes of states with 305 electoral votes. Donald Trump calls Biden's claim to the presidency a pitiful fraud. On the 17th, with the stock market continuing to plunge, riots throughout the country, international crises, and 4 people claiming the presidency, a bipartisan group in Congress meets to resolve the constitutional crisis. This group focuses on Section 3 of the 20th Amendment, which this is the Constitution. I'm not making this up. In the 20th Amendment, it says that in the case where neither a president-elect nor vice president-elect shall have qualified, declaring who shall then act as president, basically the Congress can elect a president to serve until the president and the vice president have qualified. So this empowers Congress to appoint a president. Because there are only 3 days until inauguration, how are you going to find somebody to serve as president who's going to be acceptable to both sides and can take the job on 3 days' notice? So they looked and said, well, you know, for president, we probably should find somebody who knows how to be president. So they look at former presidents, Carter, Bush, Clinton, and Obama. Figure Carter's too old. Clinton, it's a backdoor way of installing Hillary. Republicans think Obama's polarizing. So they picked George W. Bush. Now, Democrats are willing to accept Bush as an alternative to Trump, but they demand a Democratic vice president. So since they did so well in 2000, the Republicans agree that Al Gore should be appointed vice president. So here's our Bush-Gore ticket as president and vice president. Now on the 19th, 1 day before inauguration, the Supreme Court meets to consider each of the claims. Sorry, did I miss a vote on that? Yes, sorry.
You missed a vote.
I missed a vote. I'm sorry, Herb.
Do you want to do it?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll do it. Here's the next poll. It's on January 18th, after Congress has come to this compromise. How do you think the markets react?
And that's actually interesting that the most sort of out of left field solution, which is Congress appointing Bush and Gore, people see a rise in the stock market.
Peter, wait until I show this to everybody. You're stealing.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to end the poll in 5 seconds. If you want to vote, vote. Okay, now Peter, you can make the observation. It's interesting that we can see that 29% expect a steep rise in the market, another 35% a slight rise, and then so those two combine to 64%. So 2/3 of you approximately think that that news is going to be positive to the market, which is up to this point we have felt has dropped quite a bit. So that's interesting. I'm going to.
I think that's part of the factor. One of the comments in the chat screen is that really a 3 times 6%? In other words, it's been declining so much already.
No, it's a bounce back.
Bouncing back from a low.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Now, so the Supreme Court meets on the 19th. Nancy Pelosi claims the presidency because no one won a majority of the Electoral College. Mike Pence claims the Senate elected him vice president. He's second in line. Donald Trump claims he should remain president under the National Emergencies and Insurrection Act. Joe Biden claims the presidency with 305 votes. George Bush and Al Gore claimed presidency and vice presidency under the 20th Amendment. On January 20th, with 1 hour before inauguration, the Supreme Court hands down its decision. And take your pick. We found inaugurations for everybody.
Okay. So who is going to be inaugurated? The Electoral College winner, which means that the Electoral College has worked and either Trump or Biden have been declared the winner according to the Electoral College vote. Then Mike Pence and Nancy Pelosi have been mentioned. The bipartisan compromise choice was someone like George Bush. Trump remains in office, declaring the National Emergency Act, or you don't really have a you just can't guess.
I suggest we wait a little bit on this one until we get as many as possible. There are a lot of people voting on this. We're up to 82.
Tan bueno que es increíble. No,
So
no.
let's give it another 10 seconds and then we'll close the poll and share the results.
Creo que desaparece. Creo que desaparece.
Okay, I'm going to close the poll and share the results. Okay, by far the biggest choice was the Electoral College winner. And you know, that I guess obviously suggests that with all the turmoil that can happen, half of us think that the Electoral College process will eventually work. And then we also have responses for bipartisan compromise, which means and also Trump remains in office under the National Emergency Act. 15% of us think that. I mean, that to my mind, that's significant. Bipartisan compromise choice, 15%. To my mind, that's significant. Even though the overwhelming feeling is that it'll be the Electoral College winner. Mike or Peter, any other observations?
No, I think it's a very interesting poll.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
think the one thing that we may need to consider is what if there's still not enough counts for the electoral vote to be conclusive?
Well, then there won't be an Electoral College winner,
Right.
and so that's what that meant. Okay, Peter.
Okay.
Move
So,
on.
but now the question is, will the financial markets really care if the election is disputed? As we noted earlier, in 1876, it declined 10% in Hayes-Tilden and modestly in Bush-Gore. But the country is much more polarized, and the difference between the candidates is much wider, and disputes could be much greater and more complex than they were in 2000. So what are the triggers that could impact the financial markets? Will the financial markets care if the dispute is only between Trump and Biden? Will the financial markets care if there's a third person claiming the presidency, or a fourth or a fifth? Will they care if there are protests and disorder? Will the extent of these protests make a difference? If you have a couple of Portlands, that's one thing. If it's in every city, that's something else. Will financial markets care if there are international incidents like Russia invading the Baltics or Turkey invading Cyprus? Will international markets be impacted? And what will happen to the US dollar? And so these are some of the questions we'd like to discuss after we finish the presentation. What's the downside risk in each of these scenarios? Now the question is, what should investors do? I mean, if, and I'm not suggesting that anybody's right, but in the last poll, we had 15% saying that Donald Trump was going to remain in power under the National Emergencies or Insurrection Act. If you believe that, then you don't want to enter the election period too exposed. So when should people start hedging? Before the election, when it appears if there could be a dispute, or when the dispute becomes a constitutional crisis? And what's the best way for investors to protect themselves? To write puts, to sell out of stocks, to move into more defensive things? And then similarly, are there particular industries that would benefit or would be more negatively impacted by such a crisis? And are there industries that would benefit? Are there particularly geographies that would be more impacted, or geographies that would benefit? And are there other countries that would gain from such a crisis? I mean, one would guess a crisis like this could be a huge benefit to countries like Russia, Iran, China. And, next we want to ask, are there things that businesses should do to hedge a risk like this? Are there particular risks to specific businesses or geographies that could be negatively impacted? It's social unrest. If you own, if you're a retailer and you got stores in every downtown area, do you want to board them up now? Businesses that rely on government funding. I mean, the government understand if there's no president, and if they're debating 11 of the senators, the government is going to be paralyzed. How about banks and financial service companies? So what should business do in advance if this is going to be the problem? And finally, what should the business community do? Focus on its shareholders, focus on its customers, suppliers, and employees, or assume a more activist role. I mean, if the government stops working, then what's the role of business? Now, before we go to the Q&A, since I used to be an analyst, and when I was an analyst, the question people asked me always was, well, what should I look for when XYZ company reports earnings? So I put my analyst hat on, and here's what I came up with. This is my confidential analyst report on scoping the election, okay? So on election night, and for the next few days, everybody's going to be inundated with information. Many states can be predicted now because they're partisan. You can pretty well guess that New York is going to go Democratic. You can pretty well guess that Mississippi is going to go Republican. But anyone trying to guess the ultimate results should focus on 3 states: Florida, Arizona, and North Carolina. Now, you may say, why Florida, Arizona, and North Carolina? Yeah, I'm looking at Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, these other swing states. No, the 3 states you want to look at, Florida, Arizona, and North Carolina. Here's why. Like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and others, they're swing states. But here is the difference. Florida starts to count its votes 22 days before the election. Arizona and North Carolina start to count their votes 14 days before the election. And unlike Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and other states, they don't allow an extra week or 2 weeks for the ballots to arrive. This means that Florida, Arizona, and North Carolina will have complete or almost complete tallies well before other states, especially before other swing states. Now, right now, it looks like Trump's got 104 states solid, Biden's got 106. I'm talking about electoral votes. 60 electoral votes lean to Trump, 120 lean to Biden, and 141 are toss-ups, which means the election's going to be decided by the toss-up states. And here's the problem. States like Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and others allow extra time for ballots to arrive. Some of these states, ballots, they have to be postmarked by Election Day, but they can arrive 2 weeks after Election Day. States like Michigan, Georgia, Wisconsin, and others do not start counting before Election Day, which means these states won't have results for a long period of time. Arizona, Florida, and North Carolina will be the canaries in the coal mine because they don't allow extra time for ballots to arrive and they start counting 2 or 3+ weeks early. So what that means is if these states lean strongly for Biden, the election's over. If they lean strongly for Trump, he has a good chance of winning. If these states are very close, then we could have a long election process that could have some of the problems that we've talked about in this presentation. So my suggestion as a former analyst is on election night, ignore the noise and focus on the results from Arizona, Florida, and North Carolina. So that's the end of our presentation, and now we'll open it to questions.
Peter, it's Herb Kaplan. I'll try to moderate this this section. We have 128 people tuned in right now. Peter, there are 4 questions that you raised, and I don't know whether we should just deal with all 4 at once and just ask for comments and questions, or whether we should take them one at a time. I'll just briefly review them. One is, how will markets react? The second question basically is, what should investors do? The third question was, should businesses do anything to hedge? And then the fourth question was, what can and should the business community do? Do you want to handle them one at a time or all together, Peter?
I guess I'll handle them one at a time.
Well, if it's one at a time, then the first issue we want to talk about, and we've had some polls on this. We're talking about how the market will react. And if you remember Peter's slides, he talks about really, we have to talk about the extent of the dispute, how long it's going to take for things to resolve. If it's only between Trump and Biden, if riots break out, and so forth. So if we want to start talking about, if you have questions or comments, please enter them in the chat box, and I will take it from there, either call on you or read your question or comment.
You want me to start, Herb, or are you waiting for questions?
I'm waiting for questions. Why don't you start?
Okay. I would say that at the present time, if the election is clear, if either Biden or Trump wins decisively, the markets, I would not think, are going to do much of anything. I know people say the markets like the Republicans and not the Democrats. If you look historically, interestingly, at the Dow has performed much better historically over Democratic administrations than Republican administrations. But you know, that's not a political comment. That's just
observation.
However, having said that, I think that if the election is disputed, then you do have a risk of the markets going down. And I think that's why I came and said at the end, the states I'm watching are Arizona, Florida, and North Carolina, because if I watch those states, I will be able to figure out what the risk is to the market decline. If there's a constitutional crisis, I think there's a reasonable shot that you could see a serious market decline.
Peter, I see a question. It's not directly related to financial markets, but it's an interesting question. And it is as follows. Is the Electoral College allowed to act after its December meeting date? I think they meet on the 14th or 18th. What happens if certain elections are not decided on that date, but they're decided a week or so after?
Too bad. I mean, you know, that's one of the unfortunate things of the system. These dates are set in stone. I mean, you know, it's like reasonable to ask, why does the Congress have to, why is the old Congress end on January 3rd? Why can't they go to, you know, February 3rd? These are laws that are set. And so if on the date of the Electoral College, the date that the electors meet, if they don't have a result, they don't have a result. That's how you're going to get in those states that I mentioned: Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, North Carolina, two competing sets of electors. It is also very possible, in fact, even likely, that you could have states where Biden has a lead in the popular vote and the Electoral College can't come to a decision because there's still lawsuits over ballots that mailmen are selling or ballots that have been thrown away. And the Republican legislatures in those states could vote a Trump delegation in. That's the political, that's the constitutional reality in this day and age.
Peter, I have another question that deals with a stimulus bill. If a stimulus bill is passed, this person said before the end of the process, I suppose, before the election day or between the time of the election day to the time January 20th, where does a stimulus bill factor in, if at all?
Well, just remember, Donald Trump is president until 11:59 on January 20th, 2021. And the reason you have to inaugurate a new president, the reason there was that slide with the 5 presidents, is somebody has to be president 1 minute later. So we can't have a country with no leader. I don't, I'm not saying, it doesn't matter whether it's Mike Pence, Nancy Pelosi, George W. Bush, or whoever, but there has to be a leader. So if Congress passes a stimulus bill, then whoever is president at the time, if it's January 19th, if it's January 20th at 9:30 in the morning, Donald Trump can still sign it.
One more question. How do you see reactions across the world's markets?
Well,
given your thoughts on the domestic market, give us your thoughts on how that might extend internationally.
Well, I think 2 things. First, I would think that the dollar would be under significant pressure. The dollar has always been, the one thing you always knew about the dollar, it was the rock currency. And I can't, if we have a constitution, when I look at other countries who've had constitutional crises, their currencies often come under pressure. I think the dollar would come under pressure. I also think that given our position in the world, that certainly European financial markets would come under pressure.
Thank you. There are a few people asking if the slides of this presentation will be available. The answer is yes. They'll be posted on our website, reformelectionsnow.org, probably by tomorrow. So the slides are available. Another question is this. Apparently, Wall Street firms are donating 5 times as much to Biden as to Trump's campaigns. And what are your thoughts on this as it might affect markets?
Well, we're nonpartisan, so I don't want to take a position. I have my own personal view, but I don't want to take a position supporting one candidate or another. And I don't know that number. I'll take that number as correct. I just don't know that number. One of the reasons I do think, my own personal opinion is that Biden did better than Trump last night, and that but more importantly, that Biden didn't get destroyed. If Biden had gotten destroyed last night, I think the market would have gone down because people would have been very nervous about Biden. So I think today was a relief rally in the market, but I'm not sure whether the markets can fool you. When Donald Trump got elected in 2016, if anybody remembers, the futures were down 900 points or 1,000 points in the middle of the night, and the market closed up the next day. So I'm not good enough to predict how the market would go if one candidate or another was elected.
I'm just looking for other questions on this subject. I'm going to read this one without having studied it in advance. Why should a constitutional crisis cause a market decline? A constitutional crisis is the ultimate government division. Don't markets generally favor divided government? Wouldn't markets be more shocked by, say, a Democratic sweep of Congress and the presidency, leading to, well, this becomes a political question.
Well, no, but that was the point of having this meeting, Herb. We wanted to ask you what you thought. There's clearly somebody who thinks that a constitutional crisis wouldn't be bad for the market. And a case could be made if you look, for example, at the way people voted when the George W. Bush, Al Gore alternative came on, that was actually good for the markets because the markets had gone down before. The question always is, when do you step in? When do you step out? Most people in the polls thought the constitutional crisis was bad for the markets. But that may have been not because it was a constitutional crisis, but because of things like rioting and stuff like that went with it. So we're not here suggesting that a constitutional crisis is going to be bad for the market. Well, we're here raising the question of, and I'd be happy to hear from that person, if that person wants to talk, to hear why that person thinks that a constitutional crisis would be better for the markets than, say, a Democratic sweep.
Tom, do you want to unmute and make some comments?
Well, thank you very much. I'm honored that I could address this. It is not a political question. It's just something I'm trying to assess without declaring a political preference one way or the other. But if there is a Democratic sweep and they act as they are alleged to possibly do, that would upset the tax policy, or would upset the change the tax policy, change the investment policy and the profile, and could lead to pretty dramatic government, California style, let's say. So I just thought that would be unfavorable, I suppose, for business investment. And that's really what was driving my thought. I'm not declaring a preference one way or the other. I'm just trying to figure out what happens to the market. And I suppose that the market would have a more harsh reaction if in the first 100 days of a completely democratic government were enacted many of the things that are being suggested. That would be quite something, wouldn't it?
Peter, want to respond to that?
If it would depend on what the Democrats said in the first 100 days. I guess I would argue that in my view, an election where both sides did not accept the results, an election where you have 11 Senate seats and 94 House seats and all sorts of local elections not decided, plus 5 different people, or 4 or 3 claiming the presidency. I think that would be worse for American democracy and for financial markets because of the kickback with riots and other social disturbances. So to me, that would be worse than an all Democratic administration from a financial point of view.
Peter, there's sort of a
I am also not sure that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are as radical as you think they are. Kamala Harris actually, both Joe Biden and Kamala Harris came from the moderate wing of the Democratic Party.
Peter, a sort of related question is, what do you think the markets might be doing 6 months after this process? I guess the rationale being maybe there'll be some immediate short-term reaction based on all of the potential scenarios you're talking about, but do you think that 6 months after that the markets will have stabilized and that long-term investors then should not be as concerned as shorter-term investors?
Yeah, I think the market stabilizes. To me, the biggest risk in all this is that at the end of the day, a large group of people in the country do not accept the election results, because then the risk of people not accepting the election results whether you have Proud Boys or Antifa on the street, would represent a level of social distress in this country that we haven't seen before, and that would give me some concern.
There's a sort of a comment that supports what you might have been saying, and it is from Mike Otten. Historically, once a crisis is passed, people tend to move on to new priorities rather than fixing the systemic problems.
And that assumes, and that sentence assumes once a crisis has passed. And what I am suggesting is that there is a potential risk, and I'm not, this is not meant to scare anybody. This is, you know, if you are an investor and there is a 2% chance of something happening or 4% chance of something happening, then how do you take that into account in planning your investment strategy? What we are suggesting is that a divided election could have further consequences that are not immediately passed. If let us say, you know, who here believes that Trump will go quietly? Who here believes that elections won't be litigated over mail-in ballots? So the question really has to do with the stability of the government and the willingness of people to accept the results.
Peter, here's a question on a specific topic. How would a constitutional crisis affect the real estate market?
Well, you know, I mean, there are two pieces of that. First of all, you know, you have other pieces of government like the Fed. What is the Fed doing? What type of visibility is there? If, you know, if we don't know who the new president is, who he'll appoint to the Fed, what Powell is saying. I mean, there's that whole area. And there's the second area, which is, you know, again, coming back to, if you had said to me a year ago, there's going to be some influenza coming to the United States, how's that going to influence the real estate market? I would have said, that's not going to have any impact. Now, the fact of the matter is, people move that. It's having a big impact in New York City. It's having a big impact in San Francisco. It's having a big impact in a lot of cities, and it's having a big negative impact and the reverse impact in you know, in the Hamptons or the Catskills. And people are using Zoom now instead of meeting in person, which has a big impact on real estate. So again, the answer is, how does the constitutional crisis manifest itself? If there are riots, if there are social problems throughout cities, for example, that would have a significant impact on the financial markets. If it's just a debate like last night on TV, not such a big impact.
Here's a question that gets us talking about what should investors do. The comment is as follows: the election is happening amid other chaos, most notably a pandemic, but also continued uncertainty over Brexit. China and Russia may take advantage of the chaos and make moves akin to what you've suggested, with uncertainty seemingly then spanning the globe. So in light of all this, the question is, what safe havens would there be left for investors? And that can lead us into a discussion of what should investors be doing.
And again, I'm not suggesting that investors, you know, put their money in their mattress. You know, when you know, somebody came to me, a group came to me when COVID hit and the stock market was getting killed, and you know, one guy said his wife is going to shoot him because his 401k is gone. And I said, you know, just be patient. This will all come back. And I don't, and look, the reality, as I say, in history, financial markets have come back from political events. Political events have never destroyed financial markets, okay? So the logic says that the financial markets will come back. And the question is, you know, if there's going to be a downtrend, or if there's going to be certain areas that are under pressure, you know, do you want to think about this? And the reason we had this meeting today, this presentation today, is people were starting to talk about a disputed election. People were starting to talk about, you know, the Nancy Pelosi or Mike Pence being president, or the election taking months and months to be resolved. But nobody was talking about what are the implications for the financial community. So that's why we wanted to bring it to everyone's attention, to see, you know, what opinions other people had, because we think that this is an important subject to bring to the attention of Harvard Business School graduates.
Thank you. Another question: would a sharp decline in markets not drive the Fed to take appropriate action?
Yeah, but what's the interest rate level now? I mean, at some point, you know, I mean, we're going to go to negative interest rates. We could. I mean, in Europe, they went to negative interest rates, and the Fed will clearly do something. Having said that, again, if there is a period of time when it's not clear who's going to be the next president, does that in any way impact how the Fed operates? I don't know. I'm not, you know, you'll have to ask, you know, Jerome Powell. He's, you know, he knows that stuff. I don't.
I don't see any other questions on this subject. A particular question on what do you do as an investor. I would like to ask the question about what should the community, the business community do, if anything. I might also broaden that. Is there, in the coming 5 weeks or so, should leaders of every stripe, including the business community, perhaps weigh in to talk about the importance of elections, integrity of elections, and so forth? That's just adding to the general question of what should the business community be doing.
Before you get to that, Herb, I have one thing I want to add, which is, and then we'll get to that subject. But, you know, in every crisis, there are always winners. You know, the biggest winner in this crisis has been Zoom, right? I mean, before 4 months ago or 6 months ago, nobody ever heard of Zoom. Now you're on 7 Zoom calls a day. And I see a picture of a classmate and friend of mine on this thing, Lou Fundos. Hey, Lou. And so Lou has a daughter. This is not a Shaggy Dog story, but stick with me for a second. Lou has a daughter who has a company. And the company's business is providing an SAS platform to health clubs so they can stream their services. Okay, well, before COVID hit, nobody wanted to talk to her. The minute COVID hit, you know, she's the prettiest girl at the ball, and everybody is like, you know, jumping to her company. How can we do a deal? How can we do a deal? The point I'm making is that if there is a political crisis, there will clearly be winners and as well as losers. And it's just something people didn't think before COVID. If there was a health crisis, who would win? Well, clearly health companies have won. Clearly online companies have won. I'm just raising the subject that if there's a political crisis, you have the same thing. Now back to your question about the business community.
Okay, and just before we start that, there was one question that was asked on investment area. Wouldn't it be better to have cash on hand to take advantage of lower markets and chaos, and also a cash in case of civil unrest? I don't think in this area of uncertainty, people are saying, boy, the stock market's going to rise. It's either going to have little change or go down. And so this question is, should it be good to have cash on hand to take advantage of it? Because you've also said that eventually the markets stabilize after a crisis.
I mean, I'm not a stock market guru. I played one on TV, but I'm not a stock market guru. Having said that, if I looked on election night and saw that Florida, Arizona, and North Carolina, having counted all their ballots, were all within 10,000 votes of each other, I would be getting scared. And I would have more cash on hand than on the next day than I did the day before.
Thank you. So let's switch to business community responsibility, either for the public interest or in the end for their own self-interest. Let's hear some questions about that. And Peter, I don't know if you have any comments to make to begin that conversation.
No, I'd like to hear what other people have to say.
Okay.
Anybody want to raise their hand, you could call on them.
Claudine
Schneider here. I'd like to say something.
Who is speaking?
Claudine Schneider, former Congresswoman.
Oh, Congressman Schneider, my friend from Papua New Guinea.
Yes, Mr. Papua New Guinea. I have been chomping at the bit to make a comment based on other questions here. Do you have other policymakers or former policymakers on this call, do you know?
You're our former congressperson, so go for it.
Okay, so just by way of introduction, beyond the Congresswoman, can you hear me all right? I'm getting yes, okay. Beyond the Congresswoman, I am innately a problem solver. I can't help myself. And I'm also a strategist. And so this discussion, which is what I would call a what if discussion, the kind of thing I do in scenario planning for corporations, my inclination is to go toward risk avoidance. So if those who are on this call are interested in avoiding some of the risks that Peter has so brilliantly outlined, as a policymaker and one who is currently involved with the organizations that are focused on what if Trump doesn't leave, and there are essentially 3 of them, one made up of primarily lawyers, constitutional experts in this area, the National Task Force on Election Crises, and then there's the another group that Trevor Potter's involved with, and the National Council on Election Integrity. So there are a number of people that are 110% focused on that possibility. So getting to your shift in focus now, what is business's responsibility? I'm inclined to say, and I feel very strongly about this, I think it would be terrific for the business community, whether it's the business roundtable, whether it's the people on this call, to hold a press conference and to talk about what may happen to the markets and to make it real clear that your choice is for stability and indicate your support for a particular candidate. I will also say that the other thing being discussed right now is that we could use some businessmen or women who are connected to the national networks and communication institutions to ask them to hold off from doing the typical horse race coverage on election night, but rather make a pact among themselves that they will not reveal the results of the election until all the ballots are counted. So that's another solution that the business community could be involved in. And I'm also in conversations with a number of my former colleagues like Tom Ridge, who was George Bush Jr.'s first head of Homeland Security. And we've had some very candid conversations, as well as my other colleague, Dan Coates, who was heading up the intelligence under Trump until he decided to get out of there. So, and some of you may have seen the 60 Minutes edition with H.R. McMaster, but these intelligence and military types are talking about from the international perspective, how important it is that we have a peaceful transition. So they have spoken out individually, but I'm proposing that they do it collectively in a different kind of way. So I think the business community should be actively involved. I think Trump thinks that Wall Street is in his pocket, despite someone saying that Wall Street is giving 5 times the number of dollars to Biden. I think we need to hear from Wall Street and folks that are on this call to make it real clear where you feel more secure with the president.
I just want to add, just for everybody's information, that when she served in Congress, Claudine was a Republican. So.
Oh, yes. And I should also add that all of the people that I mentioned, like Tom Ridge, Dan Coates, and Trevor Potter, all of the other people working on a secure transition are all Republicans. More than 100 of us former members of Congress, the House and Senate, many of whom are part of my effort, Republicans for Integrity, as well as many from the Bush administration. They're called 43 for Biden, meaning the 43rd president's team is all supporting Biden right now. And they're all working, making phone calls, doing interviews, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of Republicans pushing for Joe Biden.
Interesting. I just want to say, I did see a note that said from Linda Sweeney, if your name is Reform Elections Now, what can you propose to make this better? And Linda, we have had about 5 other presentations where we actually, and actually have one tomorrow with the HBS Club of Southern Florida, where we detail what we are recommending and what can still be done to avoid these kind of election problems. We decided that since we'd already covered this with the HBS Club of New York, that we would focus today on financial, but on our website, you can see our suggestions, or I'm sure Southern Florida would be happy to have you attend tomorrow.
I would also add to that, we are on this subject right now because it's so timely, talking about the election and how this election is different, so different from any others. Reform Elections Now has been at it for just about 3 years. And after the election, whenever that after is, we're going to continue talking and dealing with election reform issues. And we're well aware of all of them. We are connected with or know of many nonprofit organizations that are working on our political dysfunction and potential solutions. So we'll continue getting back into that mode. But the upcoming election is really consuming us right now.
And I would add to that to Claudine's point. We do believe that the business community has significant leverage because for most of us, we're Americans first, and Republicans or Democrats or independents only secondarily. And then when we see the system isn't working very well, we're more motivated to improve the system rather than to vote for a very personal interest. I think that's an overriding consideration in terms of bringing leverage to bear when political innovations make sense. Problem is that no change is easy. There are always unintended consequences. We do spend a lot of time discussing the pros and cons, and one of the things that's kept us from just joining with another organization is that most organizations pick a cause and back it to the hilt, and we prefer to try to stay objective and recognize that there are pros and cons for most of these innovations. And we are still trying to get the business community to try to be nonpartisan when it comes to improving our democracy.
Thank you.
I also want to make a comment that Barry Horowitz said, doesn't trying to time the market like we're discussing now leave you at risk for missing the recovery that you say can generally happen? And absolutely. I am a long-term investor. What I am suggesting is that at each point in time, you have to look at what the risk and what the reward is. When COVID hit, the market was expensive and you had COVID. And that was a risk the market wasn't pricing in. In 2008, the real estate and housing prices were going through the roof and the market was expensive. And all I'm suggesting is that for people who are investors, look at what the risk reward is. That's all. I'm not suggesting timing the market.
Okay, I asked for comments about the responsibility or opportunity for the business community to weigh in, and Claudine shared her thoughts. Are there any other thoughts, questions, or comments on that subject?
I could say one more thing, since there was a question, Herb, about what about reform? What about laws? Well, there are some in the works right now, not specifically for the election that are ready for prime time, but there is one right now coming out of the House called Protecting Our Democracy. And it addresses presidential overreach, institutionalizes oversight and inspector generals and those sorts of things. So that legislation was just introduced last week. And I think that's the beginning of the kind of legislation of good governance for all Americans that the Democrats have introduced. And I might also mention that as a Republican, we are working very closely with the incumbent Democrats. So as Peter said earlier, Kamala Harris and Biden and Nancy Pelosi, whom I worked with, they are much more moderate and they are very concerned about the dismantling of democracy and so many other of the laws that have been abused, not to mention where the trade deficit and, you know, the domestic deficit is going. So I feel very confident about putting things in their hands in the near term.
Thank you.
But a comment I want to make just in general about reform elections now is that we have a concern that the two parties are continuing to polarize, and that, you know, your Democratic Party is the squad and your Republican Party is, is Donald Trump, and nobody will talk to each other. And leaving aside how this particular, one of the things that made the United States work is that when Al Gore lost to George W. Bush in 2000, he conceded. He could have fought, he might even have won. When there was an election in Florida in 2018, and Bill Nelson, who was the incumbent senator, lost to Rick Scott, there were more there were more mail-in votes in dispute than the margin of victory. And yet Nelson said, Scott, you won. So far in American history, people have normally conceded, and the system is moving on. We see the parties becoming equally extreme and less willing to work together. And we think that's an interesting issue. I just want to say, Lou Fundos asked about a third party, and the answer is the power of both parties is so strong right now. But with things like ranked choice voting and nonpartisan primaries and some of the other things that we stand for, you probably have a workaround that can lead to more independents and more moderates getting elected.
I'd like to point out one other thing historically, and that is that when there was serious problems in 1876, it took 10 years before they passed the Electoral Count Act to try and resolve future problems. And unfortunately, it was a very badly worded act. And most legal scholars agree that it's so ambiguous that it could be read almost any way you want. So I hope we do better in terms of getting some of the repairs that are necessary to avoid the kind of black swan that we have described that could happen, even if it's unlikely, so that our future generations don't have to live with that hanging over their heads.
Yeah,
it only happens once every 50 years.
I'd just like to follow up on what Mike said. As we've sort of pushed into the law, what we've seen is the law has these amazing holes in them. Like, if somebody, as I said when I was going through the presentation, if Joe Biden died, between election day and the day that the Electoral College goes and votes in Congress, and let's assume that he won the Electoral College, but he dies, there is absolutely no plan for who then becomes president. It could be Donald Trump, it could be Kamala Harris, it could be, Herb Kaplan.
That's not a bad idea. When you think about all the different scenarios that can come into play and all of the various amendments, this wasn't some grand plan, and it probably deserves this whole investigation. I don't know who would do it, but we have this kind of mess right now as you go day by day, week by week, month by month, and maybe it deserves some clarification. Although I must say that I guess we're having all of these conversations because of the COVID pandemic, and it's resulting in a lot of mail-in ballots. And without that, we might have had a more normal kind of situation. We've talked a long time. We've sort of gone beyond the time that we were going to take for this.
Herb, I don't mean to interrupt, but last thing, I promise. It's just a note I don't want anybody to miss, that Randall Hull just wrote a book on political malpractice. What's the name of the book? You gotta, can somebody unmute Randall and let him mention his book?
It's Randy. It's Randy.
Randy.
Yeah,
What-
here in Houston, Texas. Guys and gals, I retired about a year ago, and in order not to go insane, I wrote this book, which I'd been thinking about for the last 10 years. It's called Political Malpractice in America, a Republic at Risk. And first book, maybe my last, but I was shocked that it made the Book Authority list of top political books for 2020, along with The Politics Industry by Michael Porter and Catherine Gale. There were a lot of other Harvard-related authors on that list, but only two of us from Harvard Business School. So anyway, that's my plug.
Okay.
And by the way, I really loved what Claudine was saying about bipartisanship. She's right. We don't have any of that now. That's a real problem. And a lot of that, in my mind, goes back to Citizens United, even before that. But that was sort of that's when the floodgates broke in terms of partisanship.
Yeah, and Porter and Gale say that the problem that exists is not self-correcting, and the politicians themselves don't appear to be the ones who are going to solve it, because they benefit from a lot of the dysfunction that exists today.
One of the reasons we formed as a group was just that fact that we aren't expecting it to be self-correcting, and as citizens, we have a responsibility, even if we're not political scientists or lawyers, to start pushing for reform. And the reforms come in many flavors. Certainly, the states have been actually working very hard on overcoming the limitations that came from Citizens United. So if you take Alaska as an example, they're trying to go full bore. They've got something that's basically attacking both open primaries and the final four as opposed to a final five, various theoretical things, but also trying to increase transparency in terms of campaign financing. So there's a lot, there are things going on, and we need to get behind them and help.
And anybody who would like to join us, we'd love your help. We're not asking for your money, just your help.
There is a subscribe tab on our website, and we are delighted it'll get you on mailings. We try to have one event a month that's open, such as we're doing now. The subjects change, but we've covered things like mail-in voting, gerrymandering, open primaries, and we'll continue to try to make these get-togethers interesting and hopefully even effective.
So you can go to reformelectionsnow.org. We have white papers. We have our presentations. One we've done in the past are up. We have some recordings of some of the Zoom sessions we've done. You can sign on to get information that we send out. We don't deluge people, but you can keep track of where we are, what we're doing. Mike, I wonder if you should be making some concluding comments, because
I think you tied it up very well. It's gone late. We've lost half of the audience, but still had 54 people that stuck through the whole thing and probably are getting hungry. So I'd suggest we draw to a conclusion, but I do hope people will see that there are things that can be done and that they will join with us on productive efforts. Recognizing that the most important changes actually do happen at the state level, even though those are the effects may come at the national level. That's the nature of our system.
So we'll end this, and I'd like to, before we do, I'd like to thank Peter Cyrus for another wonderful presentation. He worked so hard to put this together, and he works right up to the moment of the presentation to add anything that might be new and relevant. So thanks,
so
Peter.
So far, the Washington Post hasn't found anything that they have to dispute.
Okay, so we'll sign off. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Terrific.